This week, the coronavirus pandemic has affected literally everything, and journalism is no exception. Across the United States, hundreds of journalists have been laid off as media organizations struggle to find the finances to survive. And the struggle is real for Jewish journalism too. So I speak with retired journalist Alan Abbey all about that. I'm Lev Gringauz, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. So my guest on this episode, Alan Abbey, has had a long career working as a journalist, first for newspapers all across the United States, and then in Israel as the editor of jpost.com and the founding editor of Ynet News, the English-language site for Ynet, the largest Hebrew-language news site. Abbey just recently retired from being the director of media at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, where, over the course of the past decade, he ran multiple studies on Jewish journalism and journalists around the world. And the context for our conversation is pretty simple. Because of pre-existing financial problems which are related to the struggle to engage Jewish readers and get them to pay for Jewish news, Jewish media organizations are not having a great time right now. The Canadian Jewish News, Canada's only national Jewish newspaper, shut down a few weeks ago. So did the Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish News in Great Britain, though both papers seem to be in the process of being resurrected. In the US, some Jewish papers could start folding in a few weeks, if they haven't already. And here's really what it comes down to, at least in my eyes. Right now, of all times, we need more journalists telling the story of how our community is doing, not less. But just saying that doesn't make it happen. So I spoke with Abbey about what's wrong with Jewish journalism generally, from the effort to stay relevant, to whether or not we even need it, to how there are no financial models that work, and maybe no answers for sustainability. It's not the most positive conversation in the world, I have to admit, but I think it leaves a lot of important thoughts to chew on. Our conversation has been edited for length and clarity. Enjoy. Let's jump in. The first thing I'd love to hear from you is, from your vantage points, what is the current state of Jewish journalism? Because, before we dive into a conversation about it, we should really know what things look like now, or at least let's start with how things looked like before the pandemic.
So there is some excellent Jewish journalism out there, but it's on a spot basis. It comes and goes depending on the strengths of an individual journalist and his or her editor. There are some media that regularly excel in what they do and create excellent journalism. If we wanted to throw a few names out there just to have some examples, The Forward, Tablet, Times of Israel, Jewish Journal in Los Angeles, New York Jewish Week. Those are just a few. San Francisco has a good Jewish newspaper. And on any given week, they may have an excellent story or two. But that doesn't mean that as a whole, the industry is thriving. Even the strongest of these media are out and about, often with hat in hand, asking for donations, looking for new funding sources, trying to develop new revenue streams. And there isn't a single Jewish news organization that is rock solid and, looking forward to a smooth sailing in the future. That parallels most journalism of today, with a few exceptions, such as the New York Times, for example. But even they had a few years ago until they reoriented themselves to the digital world. So the Jewish journalism, again, has some strong players, has some excellent journalists, but as a whole, it's not a strong industry.
So then, what are you seeing in Jewish journalism now in the pandemic? And, how are a lot of the issues that you've raised been exacerbated with the current situation?
Sure. Many Jewish media were weak going in, and this pandemic and this virus have been so cruel and so powerful that the weak players are getting picked off the same way it's not really a nice metaphor, but in the pandemic, the virus has taken mostly older people, mostly people with underlying symptoms and ailments. And the same way it is picking off media, not just in the Jewish world, but throughout the world of media. You need all the resources you have just to get through it. And if you go in with half a tank of gas, or you go in with a bad cylinder, as it were, to use an automobile metaphor, you can have a much harder time surviving. And that's what we're seeing. We've seen a couple of newspapers go under, the Canadian Jewish News being one of them. And whether or not the London papers survive in some form is still to be determined, although it would be great if they were. But all of the other media as well have laid off people or trimmed their staffs, cut back freelance budgets, and have seen their advertising revenue drop.
And just to hit this, I mean, this is sort of almost a self-serving question, but I think it still needs to be asked. I mean, what does, for example, the Canadian Jewish community lose by not having a Jewish newspaper? I mean, just to sort of articulate why do we, because we know that it's important, but to sort of say it out loud, why this is important at all.
Well, I think that's a legitimate question, and I'm not sure that it is important. You could step back a little bit and say that particularly in North America, where the majority of American and Canadian Jews are fully integrated members of their societies who have made major strides in entering majority popular mainstream culture, that Jewish-themed media aren't necessary because the communities aren't small, at risk, and isolated from the mainstream. And because the Jewish communities of both countries primarily are so integrated, then news of their people, news of the Jews of North America, finds its way into both national and local media on a regular basis. So it isn't as if there is nobody else covering stories of interest to Jewish Americans and Jewish Canadians. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and many others in recent weeks, let alone past years, have covered issues that are of specific interest to the Jewish communities, and oftentimes doing a very good job of it. One best example probably, though, is not either of those, but I'd say the Atlantic Monthly Magazine, whose religion writer, Emma Green, is probably doing better stories about Jewish life in America than anybody else on a regular basis. That's not all she covers, but she is a religion correspondent with a deep understanding of Judaism and the Jewish community. So, for example, you could read The Atlantic to find out what's happening in ultra-Orthodox communities that are struggling about the use of mikvah during the time of the COVID virus. She did a terrific story on that. And it's a story probably beyond the reach of almost any Jewish newspaper medium in North America, because she had the time and the resources to do the story, and she had the skills and the knowledge. And even as an outsider, she understands the issues and got, I think, a very good, strong, balanced story. So you could make the case, frankly, that in the 21st century, at least in North America, you may not need specialty media for an ethnic minority community, particularly the ethnic minority American Canadian Jews. Now, let me take the other point of view. And I think that is equally strong, and therefore that's why there's a conversation. Especially in the last few years, there has been a rise in anti-Semitism, and Jewish role in public life has been called into question and made an issue by politicians of the left and the right, let alone Israel, but also the Jewish communities in North America, that they may again once become a threatened minority, which doesn't have a real strong handle on what's going on in the outside world. And there still are community issues that are specific to the Jewish community that don't get covered on a regular basis in the best of the national media, like The Atlantic. Like The Atlantic did this great piece which addressed a significant issue, but they're not there next week or the week after or the week after. And only the local or the specialty medium for your group is there week in and week out. So for example, if we could have the same conversation about African American media, about gay and lesbian media, about environmental media, about Asian media, about feminist media aimed at women. Are any of those necessary in the modern world? And I think almost all of those other cases, you'd say, yeah, they're necessary because the issues and the concerns of those communities are not met on a regular basis by the mainstream media. And when when the mainstream media do dip into issues of specific concern, they don't necessarily have the expertise, and they're not there both for the follow-up as well. So let me just then reverse my initial claim that there is no need for Jewish media. And I think there is a strong need for Jewish media, but I don't think that most Jewish media are meeting the real need. And as a result, they're struggling to find an audience.
So then, can you say more about what you feel that need is?
Well, again, I'm a journalist at heart and in soul and in practice and in training. And I believe that journalism can and should be the mirror and the soul of a community, the place where all the conversations that a community has can be held, where all the issues can be aired in a constructive and even aggressively investigative way, but with a goal of finding a way to improve the lives of the people in the community, not to tear down the community, which is what people feel sometimes that investigative journalism does, but to repair and open up the windows and let the light in, or pull up the shades and let the light in so that the community can see what's actually going on, and as well as to foster communications among the people. So we talk about Jewish media and we talk about the Jewish community, but we know that there are many Jewish communities. There are young, there are old, there are religious, there are non-religious, there are Orthodox, there are conservative reform, etc. There are New Age Jews, there are Jews of color, especially in North America. It's extremely diverse. And the media, for one, have not understood or covered that diversity. And at the same time, the communities within, the sub-communities within the Jewish world are not talking to one another. Either they stand on opposite sides of the fence and throw things at each other, or they've walled up themselves so that they don't have anybody to talk to except themselves. So the Jewish media can and should be the neutral community platform where everyone has a voice, everyone can be heard. And most Jewish media are not capable of doing that, in part because their own communities are not willing to cooperate in that.
Right. So then to dig into that, paper audience and reader relationship, and this, I want to dig in specifically on the two topics of the struggle to survive financially and audience engagement, but to just ask you first off about the audience engagement side of it. I mean, really, what do you think it takes or it will take for Jews or Jewish communities writ large to really pay attention and find Jewish journalism relevant? And I ask this is sort of a different angle on the way you were talking about it, but I ask this because in my experience, admittedly only about 2.5 years of experience, but still, I have this distinct impression that most Jews don't read Jewish journalism, don't really care about it, and don't engage with it other than, mostly stupid opinion pieces, I'm going to be honest, or the few highly visible pieces of reporting that, really zero in on some of the issues that you've covered. And, I once spoke with J.J. Goldberg, the former editor-in-chief of The Forward, who told me, quote, the biggest enemy of good Jewish journalism is the readers, end quote. And that just feels so horribly true sometimes that at best, so many Jews don't care, and at worst, lots of Jews think that Jewish media organizations should only be printing the good news. And there's always a disconnect there between all of those things. So I know that's a lot to throw at you, especially on top of what you were talking about previously. But given that, what's your view on sort of that picture of the reader paper engagement?
First of all, if there is no community to serve, there will be no media to serve it. And so that gets to the core of the question is there an engaged Jewish community or communities within various metro areas of the United States or Canada or on a national scale? And one of the great success stories of the Jewish community in America has been its virtually complete integration into American society. That has probably played havoc with people's identification and feeling of a need to be part of a community that is self-defined and separated from the mainstream. And therefore, the media that serve it are not that relevant, because what little connection they have to their Jewish origins or their Jewish beliefs or their Jewish peoplehood is probably served by, and as I said earlier, the occasional story from the mainstream papers dipping in, and the wire services that cover news out of Israel, or they're not interested in Israel at all. So part of the weakness and the dissolution, the collapse, the slow collapse of Jewish media have been the fact that the Jewish communities may not need them anymore. But I think that is premature, and I think people are realizing not only should American Jews be proud of, Jewish athletes and Jewish TV stars and Jewish doctors and all whose names get in the paper, or Jewish advisors to the president of the United States. But that is a very thin level of connection. And then the other thin level of connection is huddling around, in times of anti-Semitism. And another thin level of connection is the fading memory of the Holocaust. And the fourth or fifth, whatever that is, thin connection is some old atavistic connection to Israel. And none of them forms a solid enough nexus to connect people to each other, and therefore to feeling that they need a Jewish view on the world. So there is a subtext, but there isn't an text. There isn't an above text. And with people who have less and less Jewish knowledge to fall back on to thicken their knowledge and their involvement and their engagement with their peoplehood and their community, then there's not a great deal of need for the media. So the media can't exist if the communities themselves don't exist. And I think all the negatives that I piled on before, that I don't think that's enough for the long term. So this goes deeper than journalism, although I think there's a lot of good journalism could bring a lot back into the community, but that hasn't happened yet because the resources aren't there. It's like a chicken and egg thing.
So I guess to turn that into a question then, I mean, what, if anything, can Jewish journalists and journalism do about that? Because it seems sort of the inevitable thing that the audience we're talking to, or that is ever going to be interested in us, is increasingly smaller, even though on the flip side, it seems that we're increasingly more relevant now because of anti-Semitism or Israel or any of the other issues. So can we address that in any way, the degradation of the community, if we want to sort of label it in that horrible way?
I think actually there is one thing there are many things that can be done. And I don't think it's going to come from the top down. Leadership is behind the times. Leadership is struggling to keep up. And the leadership of the federations and others are themselves struggling to be relevant to anybody but a handful of large donors with egos and frankly, I don't believe that billionaires and millionaires are going to save the world. I think it has to come from the people themselves. That's not a political or Marxist statement. I just don't see that it works that a handful of billionaires or philanthropists will be able to save things that really need to come from the kind of the core. They can put spackle on a cracked wall, but they can't restore the foundation. And that's not to say that's not important. It would be nice if there was more spackling on the wall so that people could see a smoother thing and not see all the cracks. In the sense of finances, struggling finances. And so it would be nice. So if, for example, a Jewish billionaire, of which there are quite a few, created, say, and this is not my original idea, although it's, that's $100 million fund to fund Jewish journalism that would be available to anyone and everyone who wanted to create solid Jewish journalism, and that some kind of not-for-profit entity that had independence built into it and a desire for good community communications built into it would be a funding source. That's just, for example, that's a pie in the sky idea that it would be nice, but I haven't seen anything. Another one would be for Jewish media to cooperate better with each other, to address issues in their own communities and to share that information with others so that somebody who's struggling with an issue of synagogue security in Atlanta could learn about or get a sense that the similar story is happening in Denver, for example. That kind of cooperation is occasional at best. And I'm not even talking about cooperating on the financial business side. I'm still sticking with the journalism side. That to me it has to come from that. A third idea that I've had, and I tried to push this without, frankly, a lot of success, is that in every city where there's a Jewish newspaper, the daily newspaper of that community has struggled, has been hollowed out for reasons we won't bother going into right now. And what has fallen by the wayside has been actually their only core of real value in a modern world, which is their absolute mastery of the local community and their knowledge and their connection and their involvement with the local community. But each of those cities has not only a Jewish newspaper, it probably has an African-American newspaper. It probably has, in many cities now, at least one, if not multiple, Spanish language newspapers. It probably has, in certain cities like in the Southwest and in California and in the Southeast, Asian minority newspapers. And so all of these papers are struggling to survive. And they all care about their community. That's their core reason for being. They occasionally touch on the global issues that affect, Muslims in America, or gay people in Texas. But in terms of their core strengths, their core strength is knowing what's going on in their community, in their town. And the local paper, which hardly ever covered them in the past, is certainly not going to cover them now. But there are issues that happen on a daily basis that affect people. Look, for example, I'll give you an example from the COVID crisis right now. And pardon me for being New York centric, even though I don't live there anymore. New York, New Jersey, one of the worst places to be in the last 2 months has been in a nursing home or a senior retirement facility. It's probably the case throughout the United States. So who are living in those? Many of them are elderly Jews because their kids are moved away or their kids can't take care of them, or a variety of reasons, good and bad. Who works there? Minority communities, Hispanics, Muslims, African Americans, Asians. And who owns, at least in Metro New York, who owns a lot of these private nursing home and residential care facilities? Jews. And so here's a story that cuts across 3 or 4 different sub-community lines about how well are they run, what the strains are on the people who work there. But there's maybe a story once in a while in the daily but it never puts all the pieces together, and it's never addressing all these issues from the ground up. And so there are stories that are being unreported that are of interest. I think that would engage people. You talk about audience engagement, that would engage people from different communities who don't necessarily either talk to each other or understand each other, but come in contact with each other in many different, sometimes problematic ways. And that, to me, would engage people at a basic level that would tell the community, wow, this paper really cares. This paper is really paying attention to what's really going on in our lives. It's not all about Israel. It's not all canned features and opinion pieces. They're telling me something I didn't know about my own community.
But then to tie a lot of those pieces together, especially on, the reader interest and the audience engagement and the donor side of things, to me, in my perspective, all of that ties into this sort of weird financial picture where if most or many Jews don't find Jewish journalism relevant, they're not going to pay for it other than maybe a few donations here and there, and ad revenue isn't really going to, do enough to sustain a media organization. And it feels like an unspoken truth at this point that the only way honest, independent Jewish journalism is going to survive or thrive even is if a few rich donors feel that they should prop it up, which, I would much rather Jewish journalism exist than not, but it doesn't feel great to be beholden to, frankly, powerful communal donors who still have a lot of influence. To me, this seems like the unavoidable financial endgame, but I'm wondering how you see that, and is there, you've mentioned a couple of different ways, but still, I mean, is there a real way out? Because the way I see it, and maybe this is just cynicism, but journalism as a whole, especially in the United States over the past decade, has done just about every single experiment to survive in the digital age. And we've still, half of the journalism jobs over the past decade have been lost, and very few models have made it other than, the New York Times and the Washington Post. So, really what is a viable financial model? And at the end of the day, how do we navigate these donors that, are going to be calling the shots?
No, those are very good questions, and your analysis is correct. This is a period of great turmoil, and Jewish journalism is if anything, slightly ahead of the curve in the turmoil, the canary in the coal mine, to mix my metaphors, because it went into decline ahead of the change in mainstream media. And no, you're right. Nobody has yet found the silver bullet, the single solution. There may not be a single solution, and there are many solutions being tried in different places at different ways. There is community ownership. There is not-for-profit journalism. There is donor-supported journalism. There is commercial journalism. There is, making money on the side by printing things as well to support your journalism. And there is, going out hat in hand asking for money journalism. The thing about journalism, however independent and free it is, it always has to answer. Somebody always pays the bill. If it's federation-funded journalism, they have more of a say than the average Joe who doesn't give money to federation. And if you have a single wealthy donor who is written you a large check, when he or she gets tired of that or he or she loses money in the stock market, then that goes away. So there isn't a single model yet that has emerged from this period of uncertainty. Again, I think it will be a variety of models and differing percentages based on local conditions that will lead to the best and the strongest and the most nimble media organization to survive.
This is sort of the last pessimistic question I have, but just to dive a little bit more into, frankly, the cynicism of how things currently look. I mean, what's your view of the continuity aspect of Jewish journalism? And I can't lie, this is sort of a selfish question on my part to ask, because I'm 22, turning 23 later this year. I can spend my time on Jewish journalism for now while I'm single, I don't have a family, kids to pay for, and I'm, young and adventurous or whatever. But eventually I do want to have a family and the financial stability to live and work, which, truth be told, I'm not seeing in Jewish journalism over the long term. And I know my peers are, also probably not seeing that over the long term. So, on one hand, you can't address that without addressing the financial stability questions. But I still can't help but look at this and ask, what can be done?
I think there will be some evolution, if not a revolution, and older legacy media may not survive. And of 100 startups with 100 different ideas and 100 different approaches, maybe a handful will survive and prosper. But I think that technology of today is taking a step back to journalism in general. While journalists have been losing jobs, today's technology provides an opportunity for journalists who are adventurous and entrepreneurial, as well as journalistically inclined, to create change with their voice on a skeleton budget, or to find a way to make a buck, enough of a buck, to continue. So if you're a 1 or 2 person operation, you don't need a printing press. You don't need a newsroom. You don't need graphics computers. You don't need to pay the local newspaper to print your newspaper. You don't need to pay anybody to deliver them, even to drop them off in the kosher delis. And you can do it essentially in your room, the same way pop music has spawned millionaires, and young people of all different types have been gaining global audiences because they're creative from their bedrooms on a laptop. If you have something to say, you can now get it out, not just to your community, but to the entire world. Sort of draw it back down to your community. If you have very low overhead, but you create material, I don't like the word content, you create journalism of meaning and worth to people. As once you get it in front of them, then I think you can find a way to build something without having the costs and the baggage of a legacy media on you. And so I think actually, let me turn it on its head. I think it's a very exciting time for journalism. And it's a very difficult time to get a job, maybe. And the daily newspaper, the small daily newspaper you would start with, and the bigger one, or the radio stations and the TV stations, whose ladder you would climb if you wanted to make it to the networks or to the New York Times or the Washington Post. That route is very fraught these days because you may not get the job. The local paper you grew up reading may not be there in a year or two. But I also know young people who are making it in journalism as freelancers and as entrepreneurs who are saying things worth saying, are reporting things worth reading. There are opportunities, even if you don't want to be a foreign correspondent and write big stories and travel through Africa or Asia and write your gigantic think pieces, even if you just want to get the ground level, the nitty gritty local journalism, which to me is, but that's where my heart and soul is. That's what I trained in, what I learned, and where I worked until I came to Israel. There are still opportunities there. Now, you have to be smart and nimble and hustle, and you have to take risks, and you have to figure out how to pay for that work you're going to do. But you're also not carrying the baggage and the historic costs of old computer systems and printing presses and things like that. So with a laptop, you can go around the world, but you could also go to every single house in your neighborhood, in your community, if you can figure out how to do it. And so that, to me, is optimistic. There is a future, but it's going to have to come in a form that most of us haven't figured out yet.
On that note of, I think that was optimism. I think we can call that optimism, right?
I'm definitely optimistic about the big picture, as well as I'm pessimistic about 1,000 small pictures.
So, I mean, on that note, thankfully we, had a positive swoop up at the end. But, I mean, thanks so much, Alan Abbey, for taking time out of your evening to speak with me.
It's my pleasure. I wish you the best of luck. It's been my pleasure, really.
This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringauz. Don't forget to subscribe and share. And hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.